A journey into the depths of ages begins not amidst majestic marble palaces, nor beneath the thunderous skies, but within the sacred legends whispered under the boundless dome of the starry heavens. It leads us to legendary deeds, to tales passed down from mouth to mouth, and to the long, winding history of a man who was extraordinarily powerful, yet tragically lost, marked by deep imperfections and imbued with truly human passions and weaknesses. This is not a chronicle of screaming glory echoing from impregnable peaks. This is a narrative of immense burden, relentless effort, and unwavering endurance. It is a story of hidden heroism that stems from ordinary but continuous forward movement, even when the path seems endless and hopeless. Now, as the world's hustle recedes and thoughts slow, we delve into the origins of a myth whose enduring significance still resonates in hearts and minds, promising depth and unexpected turns. The beginning of this saga is as ancient as the first stones of temples and the first shadows of twilight. It is a story hidden in the concealed folds of myth, skillfully embroidered with the finest silk of ancient superstitions and, as is often the case, lightly dusted with the relentless imprints of mortal error. This is the story of Heracles, or, as the Romans called him, Hercules. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. This grand tale begins not in the heavens of Olympus, but on earth, in the ancient city of Thebes, though even this name is shrouded in the familiar mist of mythological uncertainty, foreshadowing the mystery of subsequent events. There lived a mortal woman named Alcmene. She was of noble birth, possessed a patient disposition, and crucially for that era, was lawfully married. Her husband, Amphitryon, was away on the battlefields, which, in the context of Greek mythology, almost always heralded unforeseen events, like open windows during a storm, through which something alien and unexpected inevitably intrudes. And then Zeus appears, or rather, the Thunderer himself, king of the gods, descends from the heavens. He, the Lord of Storms, with his majestic flowing beard, the eternal pursuer of nymphs and mortal women, whose marital fidelity, by all accounts, was more conceptual than practical, was already prepared to intervene. Zeus burned with passion for Alcmene, not because she sought divine company, but precisely because she did not, which, as Greek myth tells it, was an unspoken but irresistible invitation to divine intervention. Concealing his true form beneath the guise of Amphitryon, who had returned from war a little earlier than planned, Zeus spent the night with Alcmene. Moreover, he skillfully stretched this night into 3, manipulating the very flow of time with a mastery available only to the god of thunder, which seemed excessive even by celestial standards. Alcmene, unsuspecting, genuinely believed it was her husband, and thus was conceived the child destined to become a great demigod, a harbinger of future trials. The next morning, to everyone's amazement, the real Amphitryon arrived. Naturally, Alcmene was deeply confused, sensing a certain disharmony in the events. Amphitryon himself was no less, and perhaps more, perplexed when she congratulated him on their romantic evening, which for him had not yet occurred. Eventually, the truth, like a poorly twisted thread, gradually unravelled, exposing the full complexity of the situation, and this whole affair, as expected, caused deep resentment in many, but no one's outrage could compare to the fury of Hera, whose intervention was inevitable. Hera, queen of Olympus, Zeus's lawful wife, was long-suffering, perpetually vigilant, and quite understandably, burning with insurmountable rage. However, her fury rarely found its true target, almost never directed squarely at Zeus himself. Instead, her wrath, like a natural disaster, fell upon the innocent women who became objects of his advances, and upon the unfortunate children born from these celestial transgressions. And in this instance the full force of her indignation fell directly upon the unborn child, destined to become Heracles. It should be noted that, from a historical perspective, the ancient Greeks believed their gods did not possess omnipotence in the absolute sense that divinity is understood in later monotheistic religions. The Olympians had undeniable strengths, but they also possessed striking flaws: pettiness, immense envy, and a remarkable lack of basic conflict resolution skills. In essence, they were a grand divine soap opera, where Hera shone in her role with unparalleled dramatic flair and theatrical scope, foreshadowing new intrigues. When Hera learned of Alcmene's pregnancy, she did not merely seethe silently with rage. No, her goal was to completely prevent Heracles' birth. She persuaded her daughter Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, to delay Alcmene's labour indefinitely, condemning the mother to endless torment. Poor Alcmene found herself trapped in an unending cycle of labour pains, locked in an agonizing magical deadlock. Fortunately, her loyal handmaiden Galanthis cunningly deceived Eileithyia by loudly announcing that the child had already been born, which threw the goddess into confusion and caused her to loosen her spell. Thus, through cunning and a stroke of luck, the future hero Heracles came into the world, overcoming his first divine obstacle. From the very first moments of his existence, he was far from an ordinary infant. First and foremost, his size was astonishing. Baby Heracles, it was said, possessed strength comparable to several grown men, and an appetite capable of feeding a small army. A very unusual and likely inconvenient combination for any nursery. Hera, relentlessly determined to destroy him before he grew strong, devised another, more insidious plan. One night, she sent 2 poisonous snakes into his cradle, presumably hoping for a quiet and unnoticed demise. However, the infant, according to myth, grasped one snake in each tiny hand and mercilessly strangled them. When his nurse returned, she found him quite cheerful and playing, with the dead snakes dangling lifelessly from his fingers like discarded toys, a clear first sign of his inhuman destiny. This story is one of the oldest recorded in the extensive cycle of Heracles myths, and it finds its reflection in ancient vase paintings, as well as in early examples of classical literature. For instance, an amphora, dating to approximately 520 BC, depicts Heracles squeezing the writhing snakes with such casual ease that even adult witnesses are frozen in genuine horror. Scholars suggest that this story served a dual function. It not only entertained the masses but also vividly demonstrated the hero's divine, superhuman strength, evident literally from the cradle. It also set the leitmotif for his entire subsequent fate, anticipating that Heracles' life from infancy to his eventual apotheosis would be a long and grueling negotiation between divine favour and relentless divine punishment. His life was a tapestry of paradoxes. He was simultaneously loved and hated, blessed and cursed. He represented the perfect mythological contradiction, the embodiment of an eternal struggle that was just beginning. Heracles was not the only child born in that household. Alcmene bore another son, Iphicles, by her lawful husband, Amphitryon. Thus there were two twin boys in the house, but with a striking difference, one marked by divine origin, the other by ordinary mortality. One can only imagine how unusual, and perhaps awkward, family meals must have been in such a home, where children of such different natures sat side by side. Iphicles, though brave and noble in his own right, inevitably lived in the formidable and all-consuming shadow of his demigod brother. The ancient Greeks, always fond of metaphors and deep meanings, used this striking duality as fertile ground for a profound exploration of such fundamental themes as the predetermined nature of fate, the significance of lineage, and the constantly blurring boundaries between the human and divine worlds. Heracles' childhood was no less eventful and full of trials. In his youth, he was educated by the most distinguished minds of ancient Greece. The wise and gentle centaur Chiron, renowned healer and mentor to many heroes, taught him the fundamentals of medicine and the art of music. Linus, a strict and demanding music teacher, endeavored to instill in him mastery of the lyre, which was considered an essential part of a noble education in that era. Unfortunately, Heracles lacked patience for monotonous scales and even less for instructive corrections. When Linus struck him for a mistake, Heracles, unable to restrain his fiery temper, retaliated by striking back with the lyre itself. This tragic incident resulted in the teacher's death, and Heracles was sent into exile for unintentional homicide. Greek legends, as is well known, abound with such examples of educational mishaps and sudden outbursts of heroic temperament, which only underscored his exceptional nature but also foreshadowed new troubles. Despite this setback, Heracles continued to grow, acquiring incredible strength and majestic stature. He hunted fierce lions, wrestled wild centaurs, and performed feats that would confound and shame any modern fitness regimen with their audacity and power. One particularly early exploit involved defeating a ferocious lion that was ravaging the fertile plains of Cithaeron. After this, Heracles began to wear its skin, a trophy often mistakenly associated in later tales with the skin of the famous Nemean lion, adding confusion and grandeur to his image. Heracles was also known for his boundless appetite, not only for food but for the fullness of life's experiences. He drank from the cup of life to the very dregs, often horrifying and astonishing those around him, with his unrestrained nature and lack of moderation. One anecdote tells how he single-handedly consumed an entire prepared banquet before the other guests had even arrived. Whether true or not, this firmly cemented his image as a man who surpassed ordinary limits in every conceivable way, be it strength, passion, or appetite, creating an aura of untamed energy around him. However, he was not without flaws and sins. His temper, in particular, was both legendary and exceedingly dangerous. This was a fatal flaw that haunted him throughout his life, becoming the source of many tragedies. The most terrifying consequences of this flaw manifested during his early adulthood. Hera, tireless and patient in her strategic cunning, delivered her next blow, this time not with poisonous snakes, but with terrible madness. One day, under her influence, Heracles completely lost all sense of reality and self-control. In a fit of this delusion, he cold-bloodedly murdered his wife Megara and their innocent children. The grief that engulfed him when he regained his senses and realized the monstrosity of his actions was truly all-consuming and unbearable, foreshadowing a new, even darker stage of his life. He sought repentance in the only way known to the Greeks, purification through atonement and suffering. At the sacred oracle of Delphi, he humbly prayed for guidance, seeking a path to redemption. The Pythia, the priestess through whom Apollo himself spoke, commanded him to go and serve King Eurystheus of Tiryns, and perform a series of unimaginable labors. These tasks were so immense and daunting that they were considered virtually impossible for an ordinary mortal. Only through this penance could Heracles cleanse the indelible stain of his past and perhaps earn immortality. But that is a story for another chapter, one that promises even more grandiose trials and incredible achievements. From a historical perspective, the ancient Greeks did not simply conjure the image of Heracles out of thin air, as if by magic. It is quite probable that his figure originated as a heroic character as early as the distant Mycenaean era, during the Bronze Age, when the foundations of their mythology were being formed. Evidence of this is the appearance of his name, recorded as Heracles, on Linear B clay tablets from that period. Over the centuries, his legend continuously expanded and transformed, adapting to the cultural and social needs of each new generation. Thus, in the 5th century BC, Athenian dramatists portrayed him as a deeply tragic figure, exploring his inner conflicts. The Romans, centuries later, transformed him into a mighty symbol of imperial power, and he was actively worshipped as a deity, testifying to his universal appeal. Not only were stories about him recounted in bustling taverns and sung in heroic epics, but he was also venerated in sacred sanctuaries and at solemn festivals. The cult of Heracles had numerous and devoted followers who left generous offerings in temples, offered prayers for protection, and even organized athletic games in his honor, seeking to emulate his physical perfection. Even the Olympic Games themselves, officially dedicated to Zeus, sometimes paid homage to Heracles as their mythical founder, acknowledging his role in the development of the athletic spirit. Heracles is also frequently depicted in Etruscan art, where he is known by his Roman name Hercules. His figure served as a kind of mythological bridge, connecting and reinterpreting the traditions of various cultures across the ancient Mediterranean. He became an enduring archetype of a strong man, capable of overcoming any challenge and triumphing through immense suffering, a theme that resonated deeply in people's hearts for countless centuries, and one that will be further explored. And so this chapter concludes precisely where it all began. At the cradle of an infant who, barely having come into the world, was already strangling poisonous snakes and who, as it turned out, was never destined to know true peace. Born of a divine spark, yet raised among mortals, Heracles began his life as a living contradiction, clothed in colossal muscles and foretold by ancient prophecies whose fulfillment the world was yet to see. He was destined to grapple with formidable monsters, descend into the shadowy depths of the underworld, and eventually meet an agonizing death on a funeral pyre. However, that hour had not yet arrived. For now he sleeps, as we dare hope, do you. Let us turn to our story, but not to its triumphant pages, rather to moments of profound sorrow. For before Heracles ascended to the status of the most celebrated hero on earth, he was destined to experience a colossal, tragic, and public fall. This chapter, dear reader, begins with madness of divine origin, to be precise, the kind that steals upon you not with the rustle of leaves or the harbinger of a storm on the horizon, but with the quiet, ominous whisper of a goddess whose grievance was deep and relentless. When Heracles was last mentioned, he appeared in all his majestic power, both in mythological narrative and physical strength. His might was unparalleled, his appetite truly legendary, and his magnificent beard invariably became the center of attention at any feast. He was married to Megara, Princess of Thebes, and for the most part had settled into the measured domestic routine of noble life, perhaps even, dare we suggest, finding some happiness. Such a state of affairs, of course, was utterly unacceptable to Hera. The Queen of Olympus, still tormented by the numerous extramarital affairs of her husband which spawned demigods, waited. Hera never forgot anything and, it must be admitted, never forgave. Soon she delivered her next blow. This time she eschewed snakes or complex spells. Her weapon was madness, the most insidious of all divine instruments. One moment, Heracles was at peace. The next, the world around him transformed into an unbearable, constantly shifting nightmare. Hera stripped Heracles of his sanity. It was a temporary state, yes, but its consequences proved catastrophic. In his confusion and uncontrollable rage, he mistook his own wife and children for enemies. What followed was not a battle, it was a slaughter. By the time his sanity returned, the palace was plunged into dead silence. His family was gone. The horror of what he had done crushed him. Thus the mightiest man in Greece fell not on the battlefield, but within the walls of his own home. He was vanquished not by an enemy's spear, but by a divine curse. The Greeks called this hate, a destructive madness sent by the gods. It was not merely misfortune, but a moment of divine retribution. It seemed even heroes were not immune to such a collapse. Let us pause here, as the ancient Greeks did, to ponder the ramifications of this event within the context of myth. This was not merely a personal tragedy. It was moral retribution, a kind of cosmic balance. The Greeks firmly believed in the concept of miasma, the defilement of the soul after committing such monstrous deeds. Heracles, stained by his crime, could not simply continue his life. No feast, no prayer, no sincere apology could erase such a stain. He required deep purification. And purification for a Hellenic hero was never easy. He journeyed, broken and barefoot, to sacred Delphi, where the oracle of Apollo resided, shrouded in plumes of smoke and deep mystery. It was she, inspired by divine providence, who prescribed his cure, service. Specifically, Heracles was to serve King Eurystheus of Tiryns for 12 years. Eurystheus, it must be admitted, was not the person one would hope to encounter in a moment of personal crisis. Short in stature, with an exorbitant ego, and perhaps overly prone to idleness while others toiled, Eurystheus was Heracles' younger cousin, and thanks to a whim of fate and a little intervention from Hera, it was Eurystheus, not Heracles, who inherited the throne of Mycenae. To be assigned to serve this particular man was in itself a humiliation, but that was the whole point. The Greek idea of catharsis, or purification, did not involve preserving dignity. It was about humility, suffering, and a slow, agonizing climb back to honor. Thus, the 12 labors were born. But before we embark on listing these feats of strength and suffering, let us linger here a little longer, because this chapter, this descent into madness, is fundamental. It reveals to us that Heracles was not merely a brute strongman. He was a deeply flawed man who suffered the consequences of his actions, and who had to earn his place not by birthright, but through a series of arduous trials. Megara, incidentally, is a figure often lost in the shadow of her husband's legend. In some versions of the myth, she escaped the massacre, living in exile or finding refuge in her father's kingdom. In others, her fate was definitive and tragic. Greek mythology, true to its oral tradition roots, is not a single monolithic narrative, but rather a tapestry, frayed, tangled, and rewoven over many generations. Heracles' crime is reflected in Euripides' tragedy titled Heracles, a grim and powerful play that explores not only the madness itself, but also its devastating consequences. In it, Heracles returns from the underworld only to find his family threatened by a tyrant. He rescues them, but is then struck by madness sent by Hera, killing those he had just saved. When his sanity returns, he contemplates suicide. It is his loyal friend Theseus who persuades him to continue living, but not as a god, but as a man destined to endure. This theme, endurance, is key to understanding the hero's character. Greek heroes were not saints, and they were not destined to be. They served rather as mirrors reflecting the human struggle in all its fullness. Courage did not mean the absence of failure. It manifested in the willingness to rise again after a fall. And what of Hera? Of course, it's tempting to portray her as a villain, and in the context of Heracles' life, she certainly seems an antagonist. But here, as with Roth, there is a deeper context. In a world where divine males pursued mortal women with alarming frequency without any significant consequences, her rage is a kind of divine protest. Misplaced, yes. Erroneous, certainly, but perhaps the only tool available to a queen in a court dominated by thunderous egos. The theme of divine madness as an instrument of punishment was deeply rooted in Greek thought. Even beyond mythology, historical sources refer to dreams, visions, and sudden fits as forms of divine intervention. In this case, Hera uses the very fabric of Heracles' mind not just to destroy his family, but to condemn him to a lifelong cycle of guilt and atonement. There are visual echoes of this moment in ancient Greek vase painting. A particularly striking red figure crater from the 5th century BC depicts Heracles in a wild, almost ecstatic madness. His face is distorted, his weapons are brandished, and he is surrounded by fallen figures. Scholars debate whether this depicts this exact episode, but the intensity of emotion, the divine storm within, is unmistakable. His descent into madness also draws comparisons to other mythical figures. Ajax the Great, for example, another hero who succumbs to madness and slaughters cattle, believing them to be his enemies. When he realizes the truth, he takes his own life. But Heracles, despite all his suffering, chooses a more difficult path, to live and overcome. After consulting in Delphi, Heracles submitted to his harsh fate. The next 12 years of his life would be defined not by his noble lineage, not by his own ambitions, but by his obedience to a cousin who could not have lifted his lion skin even if he had tried. The irony of this situation would not have been lost on the Greeks. It was meant to sting. Heracles was not sent to war or given a sword for great battles. He was given a list. The labours that would follow included killing, bringing, cleansing, capturing. Each contained its own trap, its own sting. Some were designed for humiliation, others for death, and all were conceived to break. His spirit. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In fact, there is a faint but curious echo of this narrative structure in modern literature and cinema. The hero who falls, self-exile, the slow, arduous path to redemption. From Arthurian knights to Shakespearean kings, from comic book titans to tragic anti-heroes, this archetypal blueprint is still alive and well, and so often it begins with a fall not in battle, but from within, from the depths of one's own soul. Even in later emerging early Christian traditions one can find echoes of the Heracles arc. The notion that redemption is earned through suffering, that true strength lies not only in might but in submission, in endurance, in service to others. The later worship of Heracles often emphasized this redemptive arc. In sanctuaries in places like Thebes and Thasos, votive offerings often included miniature clubs and lion skins, symbols not only of physical strength, but of overcoming immense trials. Pilgrims prayed not for an easy life, but for the strength to bear hardship, just as Heracles did. His myth inspired the Stoics of the Roman period as well. The philosopher Seneca often referred to Heracles not as a crude strongman, but as a moral figure who suffered nobly, endured pain with dignity, and who showed that virtue could ultimately triumph even over divine malice. So, if by this point of the night your eyes have grown heavy, and silence has settled in the room, let us leave Heracles at his own moment of silence. His past lies in ruins, his path unclear, his sandals covered in dust. The horizon seems distant, yet not impossible. Labours await, and perhaps sleep too. Let us return now to the crossroads of fate, where Heracles, enveloped in guilt and burdened by divine command, prepares to embark on what is perhaps the most famous to-do list in mythological history. The 12 Labours of Heracles, epic in scope, incredible in detail, and astonishingly specific. Each one a trial, each one a punishment, and each woven into the grand tapestry of atonement. Let's begin with the very structure of this service. Heracles was ordered to serve King Eurystheus of Tiryns, not as a court guest or an honoured cousin, but as a mere servant. And not just a servant, but a man condemned to perform the most arduous, humiliating, and frankly bizarre tasks the king could devise. These labours, in a sense, were a kind of bureaucratic justice with a poetic twist, atonement achieved through the performance of impossible errands. The first of the 12 great deeds destined for Heracles was a confrontation with the Nemean lion. This predator was not merely strikingly large, it was truly indomitable. Its magnificent golden hide served as impenetrable armour, deflecting any arrows, blades, or spears, rendering it invulnerable to ordinary weapons. The local inhabitants, tormented by its constant raids, had long since resigned themselves to the tragic fate of periodically becoming prey to this monster. The hero, driven by his task, ventured into the lion's lair, armed only with a hefty club and his ingenious cunning. Quickly realizing the futility of traditional weapons, he engaged the beast in hand-to-hand combat, ultimately strangling it in a powerful embrace. Then, demonstrating surprising practicality and resourcefulness, Heracles used the lion's own claws to skin it. From that fateful moment, this hide became his constant attire, serving as both armour and a fearsome symbol. Such a choice of clothing, with the mane forming an improvised hood, transformed him into one of the most recognizable figures in classical art and sculpture. Following this triumph came the second trial, the Lernaean Hydra. This monster was a water serpent with 9 heads, though some legends spoke of even more. But the most disheartening feature of the Hydra was its regenerative ability. 2 new heads immediately grew in place of each severed one. In addition, it lived in a swamp near Lerna, and its breath was mortally poisonous. Heracles attacked it using a sword and fire, while his loyal nephew Iolaus prudently cauterized the stumps of the severed necks, preventing them from regenerating. Thus, teamwork proved to be an equally important heroic quality. Hera, watching from Olympus with unflagging attention, became so enraged that she sent a giant crab to aid the Hydra. However, Heracles easily crushed it too. Later, the gods transformed both monsters into constellations, as if confirming that even minor divine intervention deserved a memorable celestial plaque. The third labor proved significantly less dramatic but no less challenging, the capture of the Ceryneian hind. This graceful hind with golden antlers was a sacred animal of the goddess Artemis, and possessed incredible speed surpassing any arrow. Heracles was strictly forbidden from harming it. So he pursued it on foot for an entire year. Yes, 12 long months he chased it through dense forests, over steep mountains, and across rushing rivers. Finally, he managed to catch it gently, without inflicting the slightest harm, and explained the situation to Artemis. The goddess, to everyone's surprise, allowed him to borrow the hind on the condition that he return it safe and sound. This episode became a vivid example of diplomacy and persistence rather than destruction, serving as a reminder that not every labor must end in bloodshed. It subtly demonstrated Heracles' tenacity and his ability to outwit, rather than simply overpower, a monster. Next came the Erymanthian boar. This ferocious creature terrorized the countryside, uprooting trees and effortlessly tossing unfortunate farmers. Heracles managed to capture it by driving it into deep snowdrifts. This was another example of how a sharp mind perfectly complements immense strength. Upon the hero's return with the boar, Eurystheus was so terrified by the sight of the monster that he hastily hid in a large jar. This comical moment was repeatedly depicted on ancient pottery, proving that even myth sometimes needs its farce. The motif of Eurystheus hiding in a pythos, a large clay vessel, would become a recurring joke in Athenian vase painting. One can only wonder how he managed to govern a state with such a timid disposition. The fifth labor was remarkably unpleasant, the cleansing of the Augean stables. King Augeas possessed an enormous herd of immortal cattle, and his stables had not been cleaned for decades. The result, as one can imagine, was far from fragrant. Heracles, demonstrating exceptional ingenuity, diverted the courses of 2 rivers, directing their waters through the stables to wash them clean in a single day. Unfortunately, because he had negotiated payment for his work, Eurystheus disqualified this labor. Apparently, divine atonement could not be monetized. Nevertheless, this labor marked a significant shift in the perception of Heracles. He appeared not merely as brute force, but as a true engineer. Centuries later, Roman authors cited this labor as an example of solving complex problems using the power of nature. The sixth labor was the confrontation with the Stymphalian birds. These were no ordinary feathered creatures. They possessed metallic feathers that could be shot like arrows and emitted a scream so piercing it could shatter glass. Heracles used bronze castanets, kindly provided by Athena herself, to startle the birds and force them into the air, then shot them down with his arrows. The solution was as theatrical as it was effective. Later, this scene was immortalized in mosaics and temple friezes, where Heracles is depicted in the act of shooting, surrounded by flocks of these unnatural birds. Let us pause for a moment. By this point in the heroic saga, Heracles had proven not only his physical might, but also remarkable adaptability. He solved problems using both muscle and mind, fire and music, displaying a persistence bordering on philosophical fortitude. Each of these tasks added a new dimension to his myth: the golden hide, the nephew's loyalty, the river's assistance. The seventh labour, the taming of the Cretan bull. This majestic but ferocious beast was sent by Poseidon, yet King Minos refused to sacrifice it to the god. Such neglect was extremely poor form, especially when dealing with sea deities. Heracles overcame the bull in combat and sent it to Eurystheus, who, in turn, immediately released it, which was quite common for sacred cattle. Some myth scholars believe that this same bull would later play a key role in the legend of the Minotaur. The narrative, like everything Greek, folds back on itself, like a skillfully prepared spanakopita. The eighth labour, the taming of the mares of Diomedes. These were no mere horses, but man-eating mares. Heracles managed to subdue them by feeding them their own master, Diomedes. The horses, perhaps somewhat surprised by such a radical change in diet, suddenly became docile. Setting aside the moral ambiguity of this act, it must be admitted that the method worked. The horses were led away peacefully. In some versions of the myth, the horses were taken to Mount Olympus as a gift, though one might assume the gods had mixed feelings about such snacks. The ninth labour was almost civilized, to obtain the girdle of Hippolyta. Hippolyta was the queen of the Amazons and possessed a magical girdle bestowed upon her by the god Ares. Initially she agreed to give it voluntarily, but Hera, as always, intervened, disguising herself and spreading rumours that Heracles intended to abduct the queen. A battle ensued in which Hippolyta died, and Heracles took the girdle. What could have been an easy transaction turned into a tragic misunderstanding, one of many on his path. The Amazons, in turn, became a recurring symbol of opposition in Greek tales. They were feared and admired, warrior women from a world where power had a different feminine face. The 10th labour, the cattle of Geryon. Geryon was a three-bodied giant who resided at the westernmost edge of the known world. Heracles had to travel far beyond civilization, perhaps as far as Iberia, to retrieve these cattle. Along the way he erected the Pillars of Hercules, now known as the Strait of Gibraltar, to mark his route. He killed Geryon, stole the cattle, and traversed the vast wilderness. At one point, annoyed by the unbearable heat, he shot an arrow at the sun. Surprisingly, the sun god Helios admired his audacity and, in recognition, granted him a golden cup to sail the sea. Truly, it's amazing how many sun gods today reward accurate archery with marine equipment. This is the kind of myth that balances between grandeur and absurdity, perhaps intentionally. The 11th task, the apples of the Hesperides. These golden fruits were guarded by nymphs and a formidable dragon. Heracles didn't even know where they were located. He sought help from Prometheus, then persuaded Atlas to fetch the apples while Heracles himself held the sky on his shoulders. When Atlas tried to permanently shirk his burden, Heracles cunningly tricked him into taking it back. This was a rare moment where strength alone was not enough. The weight of the heavens apparently required a little trickery. In artistic depictions, Heracles is often shown literally supporting the celestial sphere. No small feat even for one who once strangled a lion with bare hands. And finally, the 12th labour, the capture of Cerberus. Hades' three-headed dog was the ferocious guardian of the underworld. Heracles descended into the realm of the dead, negotiated with Hades himself, and brought Cerberus to the surface without using any weapons. After being presented, the fearsome creature was returned to the underworld, as agreed. This task, a journey into death and back, elevated Heracles beyond mortal limits. He was no longer just a hero. He was now a figure who had faced death and emerged, roaring, with a companion in tow, to complete his atonement. With this final deed, the 12 labours of Heracles came to their conclusion. 12 tasks, each monstrous and incredible in its own way. Together they formed a mythological resume unparalleled in antiquity. But more than that, they served a profound purpose. By accomplishing them, Heracles cleansed himself not only of his crime, but of his rage, his pride, and his grief. He had performed the impossible not once, but 12 times. And through all these trials, he grew not only as a hero, but as a figure worthy of worship. In ancient Greece, these stories were not just fairy tales or entertaining legends. They served as metaphors for life's difficulties, its disorders, its monsters, its misunderstandings. And Heracles, using blood and cunning, showed that even the cursed could find redemption. His labours became a common reference in classical oratory, especially among Stoic philosophers. They pointed to his struggles as allegories for mastering passions and overcoming difficulties. The Roman poet Seneca even argued that Heracles' immortality came not from his divine origin, but from his unyielding moral fortitude. Each labour was not merely an achievement, it was a facet of his developing character. And so, through fire and blood, river and sky, lion and lyre, and labyrinthine tasks, Heracles emerged, transformed, still imperfect, still fated, but no longer fallen. Therefore, if your eyes grow heavy and your breath has slowed, rest easy, knowing that even the strongest among us must sometimes clean a stable or chase a deer through the forest for a year. Strength, after all, lies not only in a mighty hand, but in the unbroken will to continue. Heracles, as is well known, did not merely survive his 12 labours. He completed them, and therein lies the deepest semantic difference. For while the act of survival is often passive, the conscious completion of great deeds always implies an unwavering intention, a clear goal, and an unswerving determination to see things through to the very end. It was this fundamental truth that Heracles demonstrated to the world. He was not merely the embodiment of brute force. He was the personification of an unyielding will. Having completed his period of penance, the hero stood before humanity no longer as a murderer yearning for purification, but as a living legend. His name, once burdened by the weight of guilt, now radiated a mythical resonance that penetrated the deepest recesses of consciousness. However, in accordance with the unpredictable logic of Greek mythology, he was granted no peace. Instead, fame arrived, which, as it soon turned out, was a creature as capricious and demanding as it was powerful. Heracles' story by no means concluded with his famous labours. On the contrary, in many respects, they were merely a prologue to more grandiose events. The ancient Greeks, always having a passion for exciting sequels, generously filled his post-labor life with new achievements, fresh tragedies, and a gradually dawning realization that fame could be a burden no less heavy than the deepest guilt. He returned to his native Thebes, but did not linger there. Whether due to oppressive shame, restless anxiety, or direct divine command, he embarked on endless wanderings. And wherever Heracles' foot trod, new stories and legends followed him relentlessly. He participated in bloody battles, overthrew cruel tyrants, and rescued beautiful maidens with the customary ease characteristic of a man whose reputation had long since preceded him. Without exaggeration, one can assert that he was the pioneer among action heroes, an ancient equivalent of a travelling blockbuster whose appearance always heralded spectacular events. Among his many, though lesser-known deeds, stands out his role in the war between the Lapiths and the Centaurs. The Centaurs, as was often the case with them, became excessively carried away by wine at a wedding feast, leading to considerable disorder and chaos. Heracles immediately intervened, wielding his famous club, and effortlessly dispersed them. It is important to note that the Greeks often used the image of centaurs as a metaphor for unbridled and wild passions. Therefore, it is quite logical that Heracles, a man constantly struggling with his own fiery temper, was chosen as their worthy adversary. Another tradition takes him to Troy long before the famous wooden horse became a symbol of cunning. The city was then suffering from the attacks of a terrible sea monster, and Heracles, passing by, as is characteristic of true heroes, offered his help in exchange for a generous gift, which often turned out to be a king's daughter. He defeated the monster, but was treacherously betrayed by King Laomedon. Naturally, Heracles did not let this go unnoticed. He returned later, besieged the city, and exacted cruel revenge. Greek myths, as a rule, are rarely subtle in their messages, especially when it comes to honor and retribution. He also fought alongside Jason and the Argonauts at a certain stage of their odyssey, although his stay with them was short-lived. When his loyal companion Hylas was abducted by water nymphs, Heracles abandoned the quest for the Golden Fleece to search for him, wandering through the forest in deep sorrow. This episode is valuable not so much for its dramatic intensity as for a rare display of vulnerability in the mighty hero, broken by the power of attachment. Whether romantic or fraternal, the bond between Heracles and Hylas proved strong enough to halt even the search for the greatest treasure. These stories, for all their captivating nature, also served an important cultural function, filling and shaping the mythological landscape of Hellas. Heracles was not tied to a specific place or a particular era. He was a pan-Hellenic hero, revered in many cities, worshipped in diverse forms. His image adorned temples in Boeotia, Argos, and even distant Sicily. He appeared on coins, majestic statues, and countless amphorae, usually depicted in mid-swing, with his lion skin flowing in the wind and his beard proudly rising in the gusts. One often overlooked story, particularly rich in symbolism, recounts how Heracles challenged the river god Achelous for the right to marry Deianira. Achelous, possessing the ability to shapeshift, fought Heracles, taking on various monstrous forms. At one point he turned into a raging bull. Heracles, unimpressed, with immense strength broke off one of its horns. This horn subsequently became the legendary Horn of Plenty, a symbol of abundance and fertility. Thus, Heracles not only defeated the shape-shifting river, but also accidentally created the most festive and opulent table decoration in human history. In another tradition, Heracles performed the feat of rescuing Prometheus, yes, the very Titan chained by Zeus to a rock, for the audacity with which he stole fire and gave it to humanity. Prometheus suffered daily torment as an eagle devoured his liver, which then miraculously regrew each night. Heracles, passing by, as often happens with gods and heroes in such tales, took aim and with one well-placed arrow struck the eagle. This moment of liberation was wrapped in an act of divine rebellion. This gesture not only reconciled Heracles with the Titans, but also made him a saviour of human ingenuity, subtly positioning him not merely as a servant of the gods, but as one willing to challenge them for a just cause. However, as his fame grew, so did the complexity of his relationship with the world. Fame tends to breed envy, misunderstandings, and political intrigue, especially when gods are involved. Recall his stay with Queen Omphale of Lydia. Yes, Queen. And yes, Heracles served her. According to myth, he was again punished, this time for killing a guest, a serious violation of Xenia, the sacred law of hospitality. As atonement, he was sold into slavery and bought by the queen, who made him perform domestic duties. He wore women's clothing, while Omphale wore his lion skin. For the Greeks, this story was both humorous and quite unsettling. It completely overturned all expectations. The mighty Heracles, embroidering with silk thread, presented a sight that broke conventional stereotypes. But perhaps this was its deeper meaning. Greek myth often plays with the concept of duality, man and beast, god and mortal, masculine and feminine. Heracles' time with Omphale was not just a comical diversion. It was a challenge to his own identity. Could a man remain strong while in submission? Could a hero, known for his fierce brutality, find value in humility? In some versions of the myth, the answer was affirmative. In others, it remained just another anecdote that provided ample work for Athenian dramatists. Then followed his numerous marriages. Heracles was not monogamous by nature, nor by mythological accounts. After Megara, he married several more times. Deianira was the most famous of his later wives. But before we reach that last tragic union, it is worth mentioning one of his most touching stories, the rescue of Alcestis. Alcestis was the wife of King Admetus. When Admetus was destined to die young, she voluntarily offered to die in his place. Heracles, arriving at the house, unaware of the grief that had befallen it, was deeply moved upon learning of the situation. In a rare display of pure compassion, he descended into the underworld and wrestled with death itself, Thanatos, until Alcestis was freed. No labours by command, no external motivations, just a hero who, this time, chose to do good for goodness' sake. He is also credited with founding cities, establishing festivals, and laying cultural foundations wherever he went. Some Roman sources claim that he established the worship of Zeus in Iberia. Others say he dug wells, built roads, and taught people to tame horses. The line between myth and civic propaganda blurs here, as often happens in ancient tales. Heracles became both a deity of strength and a symbol of order. Ironically, for one whose early life was defined by chaos, even the gods continued to interact. Athena remained his frequent helper, and Apollo, with whom he once quarrelled over a sacred tripod, eventually reconciled with him. That quarrel, incidentally, ended with Zeus throwing a lightning bolt between them, which was quite divinely apt, one might say. In his honor, majestic temples were erected, and solemn festivals were held. Heraclea, a series of games and rites, took place in many Greek cities, and later the Romans adopted him as Hercules Victor, patron of strength and military conquests. Statues depicted him not merely as a man of action, but as a man bearing a heavy burden, leaning on his club, with the weight of the lion skin hanging from his shoulders like a memory. He became an emblem, a symbol of the delicate balance between all-consuming glory and deep weariness. He was mortal, yet more than mortal. He could descend into madness, but then rise to the heights of heroism. He could serve a queen in humility, and yet remain a terror to monsters. His legend grew not because he was perfect, but precisely because he was not. He contained contradictions. He contained us. And yet Heracles had not yet completed his earthly journey. The great arc of his story still curved towards a final, fateful crescendo. The tragedy of Deianira and the poisoned robe, a deadly manifestation of love, awaited its hour. And beyond that, the funeral pyre and the path to the stars. But that, dear reader, is a tale for another night. For now, let us linger in this chapter of wanderings and fame. Let us rest by the road with the hero. Let us sit under an olive tree and feel the dust of his path, still warm in the wind. He has earned, if not peace, then at least remembrance. Sleep soundly, knowing that even those with divine strength must live with human complexity. Heracles' labours, by this point, had ceased to be a punishment, essentially becoming his profession. One could almost imagine the hero sighing over his wine cup each evening, muttering, "What now?" as another seemingly impossible task arrived on the scroll. Having completed 6 tasks, including wrestling a lion, dwelling in a swamp, and cleaning stables, one might think he had earned a well-deserved rest. But no, King Eurystheus, always eager to find the slightest flaw, declared that 2 of the completed labours did not count. The Hydra, he claimed, was a team effort, and for the Augean stables Heracles, you see, had accepted payment. Payment, apparently, in the king's view, nullified all heroism. So, with bureaucratic pettiness firmly established in this mythical world, the total number of labours increased from 10 to 12, and these last 6 tasks were by no means ones that could be completed in a day's journey. No, they were to take Heracles far beyond familiar Greece, into mythical lands, to the most forgotten corners of the world, and even to the murky gates of death itself. The first of these monumental assignments was the subjugation of the Cretan bull, a creature of truly divine origin, distinguished by an extremely ferocious temperament. This majestic animal was once a gift from Poseidon, lord of the seas, to King Minos on the island of Crete. Minos was supposed to sacrifice the bull as a sign of reverence to the god. However, the king, captivated by its incomparable beauty, and perhaps anticipating how this magnificent creature would adorn his personal menagerie, decided to keep the bull for himself. Such an act, as one might easily guess, provoked Poseidon's furious wrath, who in retaliation immediately drove the beast to madness. Consumed by rage, the bull began to devastate fields, crush mighty walls, and breathed fire upon anyone who dared to cast even a sideways glance at it, becoming a veritable scourge for the entire island. Heracles, with his characteristic composure, subdued this unruly creature with astonishing ease. After successfully completing the task, he sent the tamed bull back to Eurystheus, who, upon merely glimpsing the furiously snorting and menacing beast, promptly dove into his favourite bronze jar, a telling habit he had apparently developed over time when confronted with the exploits of his mighty kinsman. Ultimately, the bull was released and settled in the vicinity of Marathon, where it continued to cause considerable trouble for other brave heroes. Thus, battling mythological pests, as it turned out, was not a one-time event, but rather a continuous and perennial occupation in the world of ancient legends. The next trial led Heracles to distant Thrace, a harsh land ruled by biting winds and warlike tribes. Here reigned a certain Diomedes, a stern king who kept a stable full of seemingly ordinary horses. However, these animals were far from the usual idea of steeds, for, unlike most of their kin, they fed not on grass, but on human flesh. Trained to devour captives and vanquished enemies, Diomedes' mares represented a truly terrifying innovation. Some traditions claimed they breathed fire, while others described them as simply unusually fierce and bloodthirsty creatures. In any case, Heracles was tasked with stealing these monstrous mares. Heracles, taking a few companions, set out and soon engaged in a fierce battle with the Thracian king's warriors. The culmination of this story proved quite grim and instructive. In a moment of harsh but rational pragmatism, Heracles resorted to a radical solution. He fed Diomedes himself to his own carnivorous mares. One might assume that there was a moral in this act, something akin to karmic retribution, or, if one takes a more cynical view, a demonstration of the practical expediency of ridding oneself of troublesome rulers by turning them into feed for their own flesh-eating creatures. Be that as it may, after such an unusual meal, the mares became significantly calmer. Eurystheus, predictably horrified by the sight, wanted nothing to do with these animals and ordered them released. Next, Heracles faced a rather delicate and potentially awkward diplomatic mission. Eurystheus' daughter expressed a fervent desire to possess an extraordinary gift, the girdle of Hippolyta, the powerful queen of the Amazons. This girdle was not a mere fashion accessory, it served as a potent symbol of the queen's authority and her divine favour, bestowed according to tradition by Ares himself, the god of war. Heracles, approaching this task with initially admirable tact and respect, managed to impress Hippolyta. The queen, struck by his straightforwardness, and perhaps captivated by his athletic physique, readily agreed to voluntarily hand over the precious girdle. However, Hera, as was often the case, harboured her treacherous designs. Disguised as an Amazon, she skillfully sowed seeds of distrust, spreading false rumours that Heracles had actually come with the intention of abducting their queen. Tensions immediately escalated, and the enraged Amazons launched an attack. In the ensuing chaos and confusion, Hippolyta tragically perished, either at the hand of Heracles, who mistakenly took her for one of the attackers, or at the hands of her own warrior women. Thus ingloriously ended what promised to be a rare moment of peaceful resolution. Heracles, taking the girdle, sailed back home. One could almost visualize him, surely muttering to himself, could anything ever go smoothly? The next in Heracles' series of labours was the cattle of Geryon, a rather difficult and multi-stage undertaking. Geryon was a colossal, three-bodied giant who resided on the distant island of Erythea, located far to the west, literally on the very edge of the then-known world. His herds were of superior breed and outstanding quality, and their safekeeping was overseen by a loyal herdsman, Eurytion, who in turn was guarded by a ferocious two-headed dog named Orthrus. Heracles, needing a means of transport across the boundless waters, appealed to the sun god Helios and borrowed his golden cup. Yes, a cup, which he then used as an unusual vessel to cross the great western ocean. The ancient Greeks, to their undeniable credit, were never shy about the scale of their narratives, even when it came to such fantastical details. Upon arriving on the island, Heracles swiftly dealt with the ferocious Orthrus, then the herdsman, and ultimately Geryon himself, using deadly arrows, poisoned, as was customary, with the venom of the Lernaean hydra. After this began the arduous return journey, fraught with driving the enormous herd across entire continents. The hero constantly had to fend off raiders, cunning thieves, and, of course, treacherous divine machinations. Hera, ever intent on complicating Heracles' life, again intervened, sending swarms of gadflies to scatter the herd far and wide. Heracles, though irritated with his characteristic persistence and diligence, regathered all the animals. It's safe to assume this labor was not among his favorites. The penultimate trial brought Heracles to the legendary Garden of the Hesperides, a true oasis at the very edge of the world, where golden apples grown by Gaia herself as a wedding gift for Hera shone on the trees. These apples were no ordinary treat. They symbolized immortality and eternal youth, and they were guarded by the ever-vigilant multi-headed serpent dragon named Ladon, as well as the beautiful nymphs known as the Hesperides, daughters of the evening star. Heracles had no idea where this sacred place was, so he did what any mythical hero in such a situation would do. He sought out the sea god Nereus, subdued him by force, and demanded precise directions. After long wanderings, he finally found the Titan Atlas, who stood at the very edge of the world, holding the celestial vault on his shoulders. Heracles offered to take on this colossal burden, but only for a short time, if Atlas would condescend to bring him the golden apples. Atlas, without hesitation, agreed to such a tempting offer, and soon returned with the coveted fruits. However, having tasted freedom, he offered to deliver the apples himself, leaving Heracles to hold the heavens forever. Heracles, with a slight smile, nodded and asked if Atlas could briefly take the weight back while he adjusted his cloak. The simple-minded Titan complied, and at that very moment, Heracles passed him the burden and departed with the apples. Never underestimate a man who fought a hydra, cleaned divine stables, and negotiated with immortal beings. He had undoubtedly learned a thing or two from his adventures, honing not only his muscles but also his mind. And now, finally, came the concluding task, the final 12th labor. Heracles was commanded to descend into the underworld, not metaphorically but in the most literal sense, and return from there with Cerberus, the terrifying three-headed dog of Hades, who tirelessly guarded the gates of the realm of the dead. Unlike most of his previous tasks, this mission was devoid of the usual elements of theft, murder, or cunning. The hero was not to fight or deceive, but to ask permission from the rulers of the underworld. Heracles fearlessly stepped into the realm of the dead, passing the spectres of fallen heroes, and appeared before Hades and Persephone with what could only be described as truly exceptional courtesy and respect. The rulers of the underworld agreed to his request, but set one condition. Heracles had to subdue Cerberus without using any weapons, and he did. Relying solely on his bare hands and strength, honed and tempered by 11 unbearable trials, Heracles managed to overpower Cerberus and led him, furiously growling and snapping his teeth, into the world above ground. Eurystheus, by now quite skilled in theatrical horror, reportedly fainted at the sight. Heracles, having completed his labour, returned the dog to its post at the gates of the underworld, unharmed and, probably, completely unimpressed by the fleeting and bustling mortal realm. Finally, the 12 labours of Heracles came to their triumphant conclusion. During this time the hero fought monstrous creatures, opposed gods, faced powerful queens, and tamed fierce beasts. He travelled far beyond known maps to the most remote corners of the world, and returned not only alive but cleansed of the heavy burden of his sins. These colossal trials, devised by the faint-hearted and cowardly King Eurystheus, and instigated by the relentless, vengeful goddess Hera, forged him into something far greater than a mere mortal. His name would henceforth echo in sacred temples, be etched on elegant amphorae, sung in immortal poetry, and ultimately even find its reflection in simple Saturday morning cartoons, passed down from generation to generation. However, dear listener, this was by no means the end of Heracles' story. Far from it. Although these 12 labours served as atonement for his tormented soul, his mortal life remained marked by unceasing struggle, deep sorrow, and, ultimately, a great transformation. For in the world of ancient Greek myths, no hero, not even the mightiest among them, was granted true and peaceful rest. Heracles, having completed his 12 heroic labours, should logically have retired to a well-deserved rest. Perhaps he dreamed of a small olive grove, a cosy villa, and a loyal dog, but one without 3 heads and a furious temper. But no, this was ancient Greece, where peace was but a fleeting state, and true rest was reserved only for the dead. And even then, as experience showed, not always. The truth was that these labours were never meant to bring Heracles peace. They were atonement, a harsh punishment, and perhaps even a grand public spectacle. 12 monumental efforts were undertaken to wash the blood from his hands, the blood of the innocent, but they were not meant to ease his further journey through life. He was cleansed of the madness that led to the tragic demise of his wife Megara and their children. However, he was never freed from the relentless burden of fate, and so he remained mighty, restless, and, perhaps deeply within, felt a little lost. Possessing his inhuman strength and a name that thundered across the Mediterranean, Heracles embarked on endless wanderings. These were not idle strolls in sandals across warm sands. No, he became a tireless, legendary figure, woven from myth and steel muscles, a constant presence, balancing between the role of a mercenary and the status of a demigod. He was hired by kings, revered by the desperate, and sometimes feared by those who had good reason to doubt his self-control and restraint. He participated in countless battles not included in the official list of his famous labours, in wars not sung about in great epic poems. He overthrew cruel tyrants, relentlessly hunted monsters, and according to some traditions, even founded cities. At least, so numerous stories claim. Of course, it is difficult to determine precisely where the real Heracles ends and the embellished and altered myth begins. But perhaps in this constant merging of truth and fiction lay the true meaning of his legend all along. He travelled far beyond the usual boundaries of mainland Greece, reaching distant Libya, where, according to tradition, he defeated Antaeus, a colossal giant who could not be defeated as long as he maintained contact with the earth, his mother Gaia. Heracles, displaying his characteristic practical cunning and ingenuity, lifted the giant into the air and crushed him in his mighty embrace. This became a beautiful metaphor, if you will, for learning to outwit even the most deeply rooted and unyielding opponent by depriving him of his foundation. He also visited Egypt, where, as one story goes, a certain king Busiris attempted to sacrifice him, but was soon sacrificed himself. Heracles, as is known, did not tolerate such surprises. His wanderings extended to the northern forests and the harsh shores of the Black Sea, to places where even seasoned Greek sailors spoke in whispers of cold winds and alien deities. He was, in many ways, the first truly Pan-Hellenic, or all-Greek, hero. His legend grew, like a mighty tree, with every ship leaving port, and every story told over a cup of wine, crossing borders and cultures. Local myths eagerly absorbed his image, like a sponge absorbs water, making him a part of their own traditions. In ancient Egypt, the great hero was associated with Heracles, a powerful warrior god embodying strength and royal majesty. In Phoenicia, his name was linked to Melkart, and on Italian soil, the Etruscans began to utter his name in their sacred rites. The Romans, of course, fully assimilated his image, Latinizing the name to Hercules and shaping his essence in accordance with the spirit of the empire itself. Mighty, noble, unyielding, and always just a little too prone to the use of force. However, even heroes sometimes feel lonely. And so Heracles again turned to the theme of marriage. He set his sights on Deianira, Princess of Calydon, known not only for her beauty and wit, but also for a certain lively independence of character. But winning her hand proved no easy task. She already had another suitor, the shape-shifting river god Hercules, who quite reasonably claimed seniority, divine origin, and far fewer episodes of public chaos in his past. However, Heracles, never one to yield in contests, directly challenged him. They met in combat, demonstrating strength and skill. Hercules transformed into a serpent, but Heracles easily squeezed him. Then Hercules took the form of a raging bull, and Heracles broke off one of its horns. This horn eventually became a symbol of abundance, the cornucopia. It is quite poetic that one of the most ancient and enduring symbols of harvest and feasting originates from the broken horn of a god defeated in a struggle for a bride. Heracles and Deianira married, and for a time peace reigned in their lives. They settled in Calydon, and the hero seemed truly content for the first time. But peace, as often happens, proved fleeting. A dispute arose which inevitably happens when mortal politics and divine heritage intersect. The couple left Calydon, setting out to seek a new life elsewhere, and it was during this journey that tragedy once again began to pursue them. On the bank of a swollen and swift river, they met a centaur named Nessus. Nessus offered to carry Deianira across the river while Heracles swam across by himself. This was not unusual. Centaurs, though often unruly, were sometimes used for such tasks. But Nessus had more sinister intentions. Halfway across, he attempted to abduct Deianira. Heracles, on the opposite bank, saw what was happening. Without hesitation, he drew his bow and released an arrow. The arrow, as always, was poisoned with the venom of the Hydra. The arrow found its mark. Nessus collapsed, mortally wounded. But with his dying breath, he transformed his defeat into something far more sinister. He calmly and convincingly told Deianira that his blood, now mixed with the pain of rejected love, could be used as a love potion. If she ever feared Heracles might stray, a cloak soaked in this blood would bind his heart to hers. It was a lie, of course. The blood was now tainted with the deadly poison that had killed so many beasts before him, but she believed him. Years passed. The couple settled elsewhere. Heracles resumed his heroic wanderings, performing feats, receiving honors, and sometimes, as with the young princess Iole, showing his admiration, perhaps too openly. Deianira, hearing whispers of his interest in Iole, panicked, not from anger but from grief and the despair that only love and insecurity can breed. She remembered Nessus's words. She prepared the cloak as he had instructed, soaked it in his blood, and sent it to her husband. Heracles, always trusting, put on the gift. The moment the fabric touched his skin, something terrible began, a pain unlike anything he had ever experienced. And that's saying a lot, considering he once held the sky on his shoulders. The poison worked quickly, penetrating his flesh, burning not like fire but like betrayal. He tore at the fabric, but it wouldn't release. The more he struggled, the more harm it caused. His skin fused to it. His strength became meaningless. There is something deeply human in this moment. The strongest man in myth, broken not by a monster or a blade, but by trust, by love, by the unintentional cruelty of one who wished him no harm. Heracles, realizing his end was near, climbed Mount Oeta. He commanded a funeral pyre to be built. No one wanted to light it out of reverence or fear. Finally, a traveller, sometimes called Philoctetes the archer, agreed. Heracles, in gratitude, gave him his bow, a sacred weapon destined to play a role in the Trojan War. And then he lay down, surrounded by wood, and waited for the flames. When the fire consumed his mortal body, something remarkable happened. His divine half, the essence inherited from Zeus, rose unharmed. He ascended to Olympus, shedding the pain, the memory, and all the weight of mortality. And there, in what could be considered the most unexpected reconciliation in mythology, Hera welcomed him. The goddess who had persecuted him from birth, who had tried to kill him with snakes in his cradle, received him into the heavens and gave him her daughter Hebe, the goddess of youth, as his wife. It's a neat ending, perhaps too neat, but myth is not meant to reflect justice, only meaning. Heracles became a god. He was worshipped in sanctuaries throughout Greece and beyond. Athletes prayed to him for strength. Soldiers invoked his name in battle. Ordinary people facing difficulties remembered that even Heracles suffered. He was no longer just a hero. He was a symbol of endurance, redemption, a long and painful path from error to forgiveness. His image appeared on vases, in temple carvings, in the minds of poets and orators. The Romans gave him temples, The Byzantines later reinterpreted him, and even today his story resonates in comic books, in the muscular heroes on silver screens, in metaphors about impossible feats and the strength to continue. For Heracles did not merely fight monsters. He fought himself, his impulses, his rage, his guilt, and in the end he emerged wounded, burned, perhaps even a little wiser, but at peace. Not all heroes are crowned with olive leaves. Some are crowned with flames. Some find heaven not through purity, but through perseverance. And so we leave him not on the pyre, not on Olympus, but somewhere in between, still walking, perhaps, in the twilight lands of memory, still a figure of strength and sorrow, justice and error. His labours are complete. Yours, dear listener, too. Close your eyes and sleep. Heracles' story, as one might assume, had reached its divine conclusion. He was granted immortality, accepted onto Olympus, and married Hebe, the goddess of eternal youth. It was a fitting end to a life woven from pain, muscle, and flame. However, Greek myth was never particularly good at leaving things as they were. Even gods, it seems, know no rest. And though Heracles had ascended, the stories of his deeds on earth continued to ripple out, like aftershocks from a long-forgotten earthquake. You see, the Greeks didn't neatly lock their heroes into narrative boxes. They allowed them to evolve, to contradict themselves, to reappear. And so Heracles, though divine, remained curiously entangled in mortal affairs. His cults grew, his adventures expanded, whole cities claimed his presence, and in many places he wasn't just remembered. He was still active, a hero who, despite his deification, never quite stopped moving. This chapter, then, is not a single story. It is a patchwork of lesser-known tales, drifting between myth and cult, between whispered legends and formal ritual. Heracles the Wanderer, the god who could never sit still. Let's begin with the curious case of Heracles and Prometheus. Prometheus, as the reader may recall, had a rather rough time after stealing fire for humanity. Zeus, in a mood best described as perpetually peevish, had him chained to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains. There, an eagle, large, persistent, and presumably quite content with its career choice, devoured his liver daily, which then regrew each night. It was divine punishment with a certain gruesome poetry. And then, one day, Heracles appeared. No grand motive is given. He was simply passing by, as gods and heroes often do in these tales, and found Prometheus still chained, still bleeding, still waiting. Heracles, ever practical, took his bow and simply shot the eagle. One arrow. Then he broke the chains. Zeus, oddly enough, permitted it, perhaps moved by the heroic gesture, or perhaps simply tired of the whole affair. It's a striking episode. Heracles, the mortal turned god, frees the Titan who championed humanity. Two rebels briefly meeting at the edge of myth, one lifting the burden from the other. It's the kind of story that doesn't roar, it hums quietly, persistently. Soon after, Heracles found himself embroiled in another conflict, this time against a certain King Laomedon of Troy. The king, as often happens with kings in Greek myths, was both proud and dishonest. He had promised Heracles a reward, namely horses, if the hero saved his daughter, Hesione, from a sea monster. Heracles, of course, agreed. He killed the monster, saved the girl, and then was promptly told that the reward, in essence, would not be forthcoming. This was a mistake. Heracles returned later with an army, sacked the city, and killed Laomedon. In the chaos, he gave Hesione to her chosen suitor. She chose Telamon, a companion of Heracles. Together they would become the ancestors of Ajax, one of the greatest heroes of the Trojan War. Thus Heracles inadvertently and indirectly helped set the stage for the conflict at Troy, not by prophecy or divine manipulation, but by being cheated out of some horses and quite reasonably deciding he had better things to do than accept. Royal ingratitude. In the land of Lydia, another narrative thread unfolds, less dramatic in its intensity, but no less profound in its content. It is here that Heracles experienced a rather remarkable period of servitude. Traditions say he was sold into service to Queen Omphale. The motives for this event are presented in various interpretations. Some sources claim it was atonement for a murder committed, an act that was neither his first nor his last. Others tend to suggest that it was a peculiar act of penance prescribed to him by divine powers, with the aim of teaching humility and meekness. Even more intriguing is how this unusual period of the hero's life unfolded. Queen Omphale, unlike many rulers of the Hellenic world, was not about to let a demigod wander aimlessly through her domains, sowing destruction. She compelled him to labor, but not in a way that would align with his usual heroic nature. Heracles had to learn spinning, weaving, and engage in mundane household chores. In some versions of the myth, Omphale even donned his famous lion skin and carried his mighty club, while Heracles himself was forced to wear her delicate clothes and jewelry. Undoubtedly, such a turn of events can be interpreted as a comical inversion of roles, and ancient vase painters undoubtedly found inspiration in this plot point. However, beneath this superficial humor lies something deeper. This is a story of softening, of a hero stripped of his usual tools, his wild temper, his public persona. It offers a glimpse of the man hidden beneath the lion skin, or perhaps more accurately, suggests that true heroism does not always require a fearsome roar. Sometimes it merely requires neatly folded laundry. This episode also serves as a reminder of the Greeks' deep fascination with role reversal, with overturning the established order of things, if only to see what would come of it. Omphale, strong and astute, ruling over the mightiest man in myth. Heracles, still imposing, submitting not out of weakness, but out of something that could almost be called curiosity. Beyond these central events, there were also less significant interventions by Heracles in the course of mythological stories. These episodes were too minor to form the basis of great epics, yet too resilient to completely disappear from popular memory. In some traditions he assisted the Argonauts, though he did not complete their legendary voyage. He was present in Calydon, though the primary focus there was on Meleager and the famous boar. Heracles trained warriors, gave wise counsel to kings, and occasionally settled scores that no one else dared to address in Boeotia. It was said that he founded the Olympic Games, although this honor is also attributed to Pelops and even Zeus himself. Nevertheless, Heracles' presence at Olympia was firmly rooted in the cultural imagination of the Hellenes. His statues majestically adorned gymnasia. Wrestlers performed sacred libations in his name before their contests. He was not just remembered, he was felt as an unseen presence, invoked in sweat and in the pursuit of athletic glory. In the Roman world, Heracles was reinterpreted and found new embodiment. Hercules, as he was called in Latin, was no longer portrayed as a rough, guilt-ridden wanderer. He transformed into a civic hero, a temple builder, a tireless protector of roads, a patron of merchants and soldiers. Merchants offered prayers to him for safe passage on their journeys. Soldiers marched under banners adorned with his image. Emperors clothed themselves in his iconography, seeking to emphasize their own strength and virtue. Even Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, held him in deep admiration, describing strength and endurance in terms that echoed the Heraclean model. However, this was a different Heracles, polished, politicized, smiling from marble sculptures. The rough, impulsive man who once burned on a pyre now served as a talisman of virtue. He remained powerful and noble, but, one might say, slightly sanitized. And yet, despite centuries, cultural shifts, and numerous reinterpretations, he continued to captivate attention. The figure of Heracles persisted in the minds of generations. This was not because he was ideal. On the contrary, his longevity was precisely because he was human. For all his incredible strength, he knew defeat. For all his divine nature, he experienced doubt. He raged in anger, loved, grieved, and rose again to continue his journey. His labors, however grand, also reflected the smaller, everyday achievements of ordinary life, tasks that people repeat, endure, and ultimately complete. In Agrigento, on the southern coast of Sicily, stands the Temple of Heracles, or at least what remains of it. Its columns now lean, silent witnesses to thousands of years passed under winds, salt, and sun. No one worships there any more, but the stones still hold the warmth of the summer light. And somewhere beneath the rubble a story breathes. It is a quiet story. A story not of labours or monsters, but of a man who once sought peace. And perhaps, in its retelling, people find something similar. For Heracles' true legacy is likely not his strength, not his fame, and not even his immortality. Perhaps it is the fact that he never gave up, that he passed through grief and flame, across continents and centuries, leaving behind an image, a memory, that says struggle is not failure, that hard work is not defeat, that even the strongest must kneel and rise again. Thus, when the name Heracles is uttered in the modern world, people do not merely mark the places he touched. They trace how he continues to hold significance. In philosophy, in art, in those subtle metaphors that are sometimes used unconsciously. To call someone Herculean is not only to acknowledge their strength, but also to emphasize their determination, perseverance, and ability to face challenges that no one else can. And this, perhaps, is the truest legacy of all. Not the temples, not the films, not the myths carved in fading marble, but the idea that strength is not the absence of difficulty, but the ability to confront it, calmly, relentlessly, with dignity. Therefore, wherever one may be today, whether under electric light or ancient stars, one should know that he who once wrestled with giants is now an invisible presence in one's own story. And perhaps, when circumstances seem too arduous to overcome, one can remember him and still try. It is time for rest. The world can wait. The next labour begins in the morning. Stories have a way of ending, but not all at once. Some fade gently like candlelight at the bottom of a glass. Others chime on for so long they seem to forget how to stop. And some, the rare ones, live on long after the last sentence has been spoken. Hercules, or Heracles as he was originally called, is one such story. He began his journey, like many Greek heroes, in contradiction, part god, part man, born of an illicit union between Zeus and a mortal woman, hated by the queen of the gods before he could utter a single word, loved by many but feared by more. He was called upon to atone through deeds so difficult they were never forgotten. People tracked him throughout his journey. The snakes in the cradle, the labours that pushed the boundaries of the world, moments of madness, wrestling with river gods and monsters, and the grief itself, the poisoned robe, the flames, the ascent to Olympus, the finding of a difficult peace. But even after countless retellings and thousands of words, the question remains, why does he live on? Not just in temples and textbooks, not just on the pages of epic poems or in the flickering frames of Saturday morning cartoons, but in people's minds. Why is Hercules still present? In metaphors, in gyms, in dreams, in quiet internal dialogues. Perhaps his longevity is not so much about strength. Strength is everywhere in myths. Titans held the sky. Cyclopes threw boulders. Achilles was fast. Odysseus was clever. Theseus was brave. But Heracles was different. Not what he could do, but what he had to do. And more importantly, what he endured in doing it. The Greeks never pretended Heracles was perfect. He was impulsive, unpredictable. He killed when he shouldn't have. He cried when others might not. He asked for help. He made mistakes and paid for them for years. And yet, through it all, he kept going. This, more than the lion skin or the club, is the true shape of his legacy: persistence. The Greeks had a word for this, karteria, meaning endurance. It is the ability to suffer with dignity, to bear the unbearable, to carry your guilt on your back like a sack of stones and still climb the mountain, to clean the stables when the stench is unbearable, to fight a hydra knowing it only grows more heads, to take on tasks no one asked for, to clean up the mess left by others, and to do it not because it will bring glory, but because it simply needs to be done. Heracles became the embodiment of these ideas. He was not a hero of victory in its purest form. He was a hero of effort. The Stoics understood this clearly. For them, he was not just a collection of muscles. He represented a moral backbone. Marcus Aurelius, in his Meditations, does not name Heracles directly, but his influence is felt in the emperor's tone. A man must build his life action by action, he writes, and be content if each one achieves its purpose as far as it can, and no one can prevent him from doing this. In essence, this is the life Heracles lived. Not clean, not easy, not without mistakes, but persistent. And in persistence, there is something divine, even in death, or deification, depending on one's perspective. Heracles did not settle into stillness. He did not become some detached, distant deity, drifting on clouds, sipping ambrosia in boring omnipotence. He remained active, invoked, present. In Thebes, athletes poured oil on altars in his name. Wrestlers rubbed their hands and whispered prayers to him. Soldiers painted the lion's head on their shields, not because they expected invulnerability, but because they needed courage. Merchants left offerings before long journeys. even ordinary people, not kings, not warriors, not philosophers, saw in him one who knew what hard work was. There is comfort in this, to imagine that such a mighty figure still understood hardship, that even gods once had to suffer long days and difficult choices, that the divine could arise not only from miracles, but from repetition, from resilience. The essence of this mythological character also changed through the centuries, which undoubtedly constituted a significant part of its inner power. It transformed, taking on the forms and traits that people needed in specific historical periods. For the ancient Greeks, he appeared as an imperfect yet persistent mortal, constantly striving for self-improvement, for the transformation of his nature. The Romans, on the other hand, saw him as a mighty, muscular comrade of their empire, an embodiment of civilization, confidence and discipline, in the minds of Christians of late. Antiquity. Heracles acquired the features of a peculiar pagan penitent, a figure who suffered for past transgressions and ultimately emerged from the crucible of trials completely transformed. With the advent of the Renaissance, the image of Heracles once again appeared before humanity, embodying the ideal of the perfect man. He was mighty in body, possessed an unbreakable spirit, and although his depictions often showed a nude figure in marble, his posture always remained majestic and upright. In the modern world, he finally established himself as the archetype of the hero's journey, a universal narrative model that includes inevitable trials, personal growth, and ultimately, triumph, even if the names of the characters changed. In him, people recognized the traits of Gilgamesh, Beowulf, Frodo, Luke Skywalker. Each of these characters, beginning their journey unprepared, faces suffering, experiences setbacks, acquires knowledge, and, despite the wounds received, gains wisdom and achieves victory. His presence was felt everywhere, even if people didn't always realize it. He manifested in the firefighter, bravely breaking through acrid smoke, saving lives. He could be seen in the parent working 2 jobs, striving to ensure their family's well-being. He lived in the student burning the midnight oil, cherishing hope for a future that sometimes seems impossible. His spirit was present in the artist who, despite past failures, picks up the brush again and again, in the heartbroken person who slowly but surely walks the path of healing. This essence dwells not only among the mighty and celebrated, but also among those who struggle, who overcome difficulties, and it has invariably been there since the beginning of time. Heracles, as a mythological figure, appeals not to human fantasies and dreams, but to a deeply rooted sense of weariness and exhaustion familiar to everyone. He seems to utter words of encouragement, asserting, "Yes, it's hard. Yes, you made mistakes. Yes, you're tired, but keep going anyway. Perform the next labor, fight the next beast, clean the next stable, try again. And if you fail, well, even Heracles sometimes failed." In this message lies the wisdom of acknowledging human weakness and simultaneously calling for unwavering perseverance. The ancient Greeks, despite their dramatic worldview, deeply and silently understood this truth. Temples dedicated to Heracles were often erected along busy roads, at bustling crossroads, and by majestic city gates. That is, in the very places where travellers constantly moved, burdened by long distances, the concerns of trade, or under the weight of fear. Their prayers were offered not only for the granting of physical strength, but also for the ability to continue the journey without giving up. As offerings, they left oil, balm for weary muscles, and simple but nourishing food. They asked for patience, genuine courage, and inner peace. And this practice was not limited to Greece alone. It spread along Roman roads, in the bustling forums of Spain and Gaul, and on the harsh, windswept borders of Britain. Heracles' name spread throughout the world, not as a symbol of grand spectacle or ostentatious power, but as a quiet yet strong seed of hope. He transformed into a kind of spiritual companion, becoming a deity not of thunderous feats and might, but rather of a tired yet resolute nod at the end of an exhausting day. It seems highly indicative that Hercules was never associated with a god of conquest, bloody wars, or royal power. Instead, he symbolized tireless effort, the will to survive, and the image of a weary hero who, despite everything, simply kept going. In this essence lies something deeply and poignantly human. Even his apotheosis, that is, the process of becoming a god, is described not as a triumphant ascent to glory, but rather as a deliverance, as a liberation from earthly bonds. He is not carried to the heavens in a blaze of chariots and the sound of trumpets. Instead, he burns in agonizing fire, his mortal flesh consumed by unbearable pain, and through this suffering, a divine essence is revealed, not in the form of a glittering crown or external majesty, but as a quiet, unyielding core that persists when all transient things disappear. Ultimately, he attains the true form of the being he was always destined to become, not perfect, but absolutely whole. Thus, as the narrative of Heracles draws to a close, one inevitably wonders what remains after him. Not the monsters, for they have long been vanquished and vanished, nor the labours themselves, for they were his personal lot. Something far deeper and more universal remains, an idea. It is the idea that people are capable of facing difficulties, even when they seem utterly insurmountable. It is the conviction that true strength is measured not in loud glory or external honours, but in constant, persistent effort. It is the realization that to matter, one does not have to be a deity. It is enough simply to keep going, and no less importantly, sometimes to stop, to lay down one's burdens, to rest by a warm fire, to eat, drink, sleep. Heracles undoubtedly would understand this need. He, more than anyone, earned his rest and his sleep after all his accomplishments. And now every person following his example also has a right to a well-deserved rest. And so, as it is time for completion, let each person close their eyes, releasing the world's hustle. All labours are behind. The lion has long been tamed, its fury quelled. The snakes are silent, their threat past. Arrows are spent in battles. One is not broken, one has not fallen behind on their path. One simply continues to become, to evolve, to reveal their true essence. Like Heracles, like all of us, in this long and slow process of formation. No one is alone on this journey. The stars that shine in the heavens remember him, and they remember each of us. May a peaceful night come to the hero within everyone. Sleep well.